Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we have got 3 projects going on, one grand project and then 2 little more immediate projects. The grand project is that we're working through the book of Matthew a little bit every day. So whether you've been here for a real long time or whether you are just starting on this thing today because somebody politely asked you to give it a try, welcome or welcome back, as it were. I'm glad you're hanging out with me, and we are going to keep chipping away at this book. We're in Matthew chapter 22 right now, and so if you can do the math, it's like 500 episodes or something like that. We're not exactly hustling, but we're having fun, and this is the one format that allows you and I to dive as deep as we want to into any of these little rabbit trails or supporting details behind the text or historical context behind the text or philosophical questions that might come out of the text. Yeah, I mean, you just can't do that going to church on Sunday morning. Church is more important. It's a bigger deal. It's a different thing, but it's also on a schedule. And here we just got all the time in the world. So as a result, we are taking that time and working our way through the book of Matthew. And I'm very happy with our progress. That's a big project. The little project is that we're in Matthew 22 and verse 23. We're on the heels of a situation in Jerusalem where Jesus, bringing quite the reputation with him and receiving quite the welcome, rolls into Jerusalem, and the religious political leaders don't like it. He's a threat. He doesn't fit into any categories. He's a problem. And so the Pharisees, the main political party of the day, shows up and they take a few swings at him verbally. It doesn't work out. He's just too smart. He handles his business. We see that in chapter 21. Well, we see it through the whole book of Matthew, but we just looked at it in chapter 21. And then the Pharisees send their doe-eyed younglings to go and talk to Jesus, along with a completely rival political party, the people who supported the Herod family and the Roman occupation, the Herodians. And together as a weird team, they take a swipe at Jesus, asking him stuff about, should you pay taxes to Caesar? But Jesus says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God's. And everybody's amazed, and they all have to walk away confused and baffled because Jesus was impressive, and they weren't. And now that anecdote wraps up, and then we roll into verse 23, which reads as follows. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to him with a question. And there's a whole bunch of stuff after this that we're going to get to. But that one little verse gives us our 2 miniature projects that we're working on right now. One is, who are the Sadducees and where do they fit? And we spent some time talking about that yesterday. We'll finish that up today. And then the other is, what's the deal of the question on resurrection? Like, it seems like, don't religious people believe there's something happens after death? There's some kind of resurrection or something? How can this even be a question? So I guess we're going to have to go back and just do a brain check and see what that looks like in the book of Matthew and the rest of the Bible, and try to understand how much of an outlier understanding this rejection of the idea of resurrection, of life after death, would have been that these Sadducees apparently held. So the Sadducees are the number 2 ranking political party of this era. They got their start just about the time that the Jewish people had had enough of the descendants of the generals of Alexander the Great, who had been governing them for like 150 years. So imagine United States Civil War up till now. That much time has gone by with these Greek rulers governing in Judea, Galilee, the whole area we're looking at here in the book of Matthew. And they've got Greek values. I mean, that's what they were sent out to do by Alexander the Great. Go around and Greekify everything. Greek language it, Greek culture it, Greek intermarry it, Greek religion it. And the Jewish people are like, we have a perfectly good God. Like, we're fine. We do not need your weird Greek gods. We're not interested. That looks more like a soap opera. We believe in one God. He does not look like a soap opera. We like our setup way, way better. And they try to make it work for a period of time, mostly out of weakness. They just weren't in a position to do anything about this increasingly intrusive Greek governance. They're Greek overlords who were there making their lives difficult. But finally, things escalate to a point as it becomes more and more intrusive. They're like, no. And they have a rebellion. They throw the thing off. And the 2 political parties that emerge out of this, I should say religious political hybrid parties, are the very famous Pharisees and the slightly less famous Sadducees. These 2 parties have a whole lot of sway from about the middle of the 2nd century BC, so 150-ish years before Jesus, roughly 100 years before Julius Caesar is in his heyday and eventually assassinated. That's where this fits. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they are in their prime from 150-ish BC up until the temple is destroyed by Titus and Vespasian in 70 AD. And at that point, well, for obvious reasons, their influence wanes dramatically. As I mentioned yesterday, the Sadducees are generally historically regarded as the losers here, and thus most of what we know about them is from people who criticize them, like Flavius Josephus, the famous first century historian who really doesn't have much of anything nice to say about them at all. And I've got my handy dandy copy of the Antiquities by Josephus right here, and in Book 18, starting in line 16, we get a description of the Sadducees in contrast to the Pharisees, who Josephus just got done talking about. It goes like this. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the bodies, nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them, for they think it an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine is received by but a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity. But they're able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear with them. All right, what are we getting from this firsthand account from Josephus? One, we're getting that he felt much more political affinity with the Pharisees. Just imagine the historical, I'm making air quotes, description that you or I would write of a political party we reject. How much care would you take to make sure that you really fairly characterized them and cast their views in the best possible light and their characters in the best possible light? I mean, come on, politics are poison. They put us in a place where we don't feel a lot of charity or empathy to other people, and where we feel, maybe justifiably, a degree of moral obligation to point out the madness and insanity of the people who are wrong. Well, if you can picture that, then you can understand what Josephus is doing here, but still we can glean a few things. He affirms what Matthew is saying here in Matthew 22, that they believe that the self dies with the body, no resurrection. Interesting. Also, they like to engage in arguments and disputes, so that sounds like a political party, but maybe in more of a rabbinical style, because, I mean, let's be honest, we don't really do meaningful philosophical disputation in our politics today. We do power games and we yell at each other. So this does indicate that maybe there was a bit more of a desire to be pedantic and to argue back and forth and really get into some of the specific details. Again, bearing in mind, if this is a negative description of these people, he's still acknowledging that they like to think. But their attitude, Josephus is saying, toward the predominant philosophy of the day and toward what we would call the Old Testament is not very popular. Yet weirdly, he acknowledges that the upper class seemed to like the Sadducees. Maybe it's because the Sadducees had a little more lax view on behavioral issues, but the upper crust seemed to be a little more at peace with them. So in this respect, the Sadducees would be a little bit more on the left end of the spectrum in terms of moral behavioral expectation and how things ought to be with your personal pietistic conduct, and the Pharisees apparently would be a little bit more on the right end of the spectrum in terms of higher expectations there. And in that regard, I would expect the highly entitled, very elite upper crust types to feel a lot more comfortable with the moral laxness regarding some of the more questionable and problematic Roman and Greek habits that were popular among said upper crust, but that would not square neatly with the teachings of the Old Testament. On the other hand, though, based on the descriptions that I'm seeing here, the Sadducees would be more akin to a legal conservatism. That is saying, no, we are originalists. We go with what was written down in the first place. We don't believe in all of this case law and oral tradition that has come along after the fact, whereas the Pharisees would be much more interested in studying this entire voluminous catalog of decisions that have been made along the way that add clarity and circumstantial specificity to what to do regarding the general principles laid out in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. So it's kind of a mix. I made a video once where I was like, this group is the more liberal, this group is the more conservative, but it sort of depends on what issue you're asking about. So in summary, the Sadducees really would be the weaker party. Their position on resurrection really would be the minority position among the people over whom they governed and with whom they interacted in Judea and Galilee. They were apparently pretty popular amongst the upper crust. Maybe the Roman elites, the Herodian elites, regarded them as being a bit more controllable or amenable, like, you do your thing, we'll do ours, let's just make each other rich kind of a deal. Because even though they were this minority party, it looks like at least for a period of time around what we're looking at right here, they were the majority party in terms of prominent appointments and even high priesthood appointments. So hopefully that gives us a little bit of a sense of who's walking up to Jesus right now in Matthew chapter 22 and how that's different than who walked up to Jesus, just an anecdote earlier alongside the Herodians. These are not the same people. They are not on the same team. I'm not even positive they're actually making common cause here with any kind of plan they have together, as much as neither of these groups has figured out how to co-opt Jesus into their thing and force Jesus into their narrative to weaponize for their own political advancement. They're feeling him out, and if I can't co-opt him and can't get him on my team, then we're just going to destroy him. Maybe on that, they agreed. So hopefully that sets us up for success on the question of who the Sadducees are. And now tomorrow we'll look at the question most associated with them, and that is the idea of resurrection in general and what people thought about that at this time. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.